Yeah, so thanks Maurizio for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. I've been hearing about CREAF for a long time from Jordi and Maurizio and my other colleague Trevor Keenan, and everyone who speaks very highly of the research environment here, and so it's great to finally see you guys. I'm going to talk about this. This is a very high level talk that I'm going to give, in the sense that it doesn't have much science in it. It's going to be kind of what I'm trying to do is basically make people aware of this tool we've developed and some of the philosophies that we're trying to follow to kind of broaden the participation of both the physiological and the sort of ecological communities in Earth system model development, right? Kind of open that process up and democratize it, and bring more people into provide their expertise and data and stuff to accelerate the process of representing, I guess, the biosphere, feedbacks to climate change, etc. So I'm kind of in some ways, a spokesperson for this huge team of people who work on the community land model and this FATES project, particularly Charlie Coven, who co-leads the FATES project with me from Berkeley. And so I'm going to skip that. So like Maurizio said, I kind of began my career in this drought experiment in Kashwanar, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And what we were doing there was we were trying to kind of think about how the plant hydraulics worked under these kind of reduced rainfall conditions. And so what I did was kind of went out and tested the theory which was in the model that I was using at the time, which was called SPAR. And the theory is quite simple in kind of modern plant hydrodynamics terms. It's just a sort of this idea of this isohydric limit that trees have. They just sort of close their stomata when they get down to some minimum water potential. And so that was kind of in my PhD advisor's ecosystem model, and so I kind of went and tested those theories at this site by kind of collecting diurnal cycles with leaf water potential and stomatal conductance and sap flow, and so I kind of that's kind of how I got into this whole idea of sort of scaling up ecosystem physiology to plot scale and then regional scale and global scale. And mostly I put this up because it's good. People often think that modelers don't know what trees look like, and so this is kind of my my sort of plea to you that that's only partly true. and then in this really fun summer of 2005, which Jordi and I spent in this forest just outside Edinburgh, doing this kind of crazy thing where we were trying to hang these branch bags down this profile of these Scots pine forests. And they sent me to this course to become a tree climber, which was great. And so we spent lots of our time with sellotape and glue, trying to glue all these temperature sensors and things together. And it was awesome. And then one day this huge storm came along and destroyed all the branch bags. And it was like a tragic end that maybe we've moved on, I don't know. Everyone's gone on to greater and better things, so it's fine. But anyway, and then after that, after a few more things, I ended up here. This is kind of a hilarious photograph of what Boulder, Colorado looks like. There's some crazy angle of it, but really there's big snowy mountains behind, and this is the National Centre for Atmospheric Research on a hill in this kind of pine forest. And so I've been a scientist there since 2010. I've been working on the Community Earth System model, which is this sort of open source, sort of collaborative. It's designed as a collaborative project with the university community in the States, right? So the idea is that NCAR operate with a part of the National Science Foundation budget in America, which would otherwise be sent to universities. And so the idea is that it's like a collective resource to do a thing that the universities by themselves would never be able to do, right? Which is build an Earth system model. But it's implicitly designed to be sort of driven by contributions from other teams. And so this is just a picture of the different bits of an Earth system model. If you never thought about that, there's an atmosphere and a land and land ice and ocean and sea ice, and the size of the bubbles is the number of lines of code. So actually NCAR has the biggest number of lines of land code. I don't know if that might be good or bad. So And so the land part of the CESM is called the community land model, and because many Earth system modelling groups globally don't have a big land expertise, they kind of arise from atmospheric groups mostly. People tend to sort of take our open source land model and kind of bolt it onto the bottom of their atmosphere models, and so it's kind of like this code is in kind of a crazy array of different models worldwide. And so yeah, so I've been there working on this project since 2009, and then last year some stuff happened a couple of years ago, some stuff happened in the States that was unfortunate from a climate science perspective that I wouldn't go into, and this happened also, and so this is my husband Ben, there he is, getting his laureate, which is what they call it in France. He's a laureate of this project, and so we moved to France, and so we moved to France, and nevertheless I am still working for the CLM project, kind of trying to further all these goals as a sort of, I guess, like a European envoy or something. And so the goals of our project are to have this open source collaborative model of the Earth system. And we have this kind of boundary condition that the processes that we consider have to have impacts on the biophysical or biogeochemical feedbacks in the Earth system. So that kind of is a very loose boundary condition on things that we can think about including, but it means that we have at least a framework for saying, you know, that particular tiny detail that you're considering putting in the model is perhaps a little too out there. I didn't mean to look at you in that eye there, by the way. That was we were having that conversation about how you thought your model was not maybe Earth system model. I disagree, but anyway. And so it's kind of, the CLM project is motivated by representing the biophysical and biogeochemical feedbacks to climate change of the land surface. But it's also increasingly inclusive of what you might call climate impact processes, because the tool we've built is, it turns out, you know, actually quite advanced at predicting things like heat waves and urban heat islands and flooding and crop failure and tree mortality and all these things that humans care about. So that's also an expanding part of our work. And so our idea is to kind of respond to the kind of needs of the user community and the push from the scientific community. Mostly, like, people write papers and say, you guys suck at doing all of these things, they need to be changed, and so we try and respond to that. And so we're trying to demystify and democratize and accelerate land surface model development, which historically hasn't been very fast or democratic, and has often been quite mysterious. And so that's kind of one of our major goals, is to expand and inclusivize this process. And so this is just a picture of people smiling, illustrative of the collaborative team effort that we're trying to develop. These are real people who really work on CLM. To understand this talk, you need to understand that there's more than one version of the CLM model. And so I'm going to talk about the first version, and then talk about the kind of more advanced version later. So the first version called I'm talking about is called CLM5, right? And so CLM5 is the latest version of the sort of standard CLM model. And we released that last year to the community, by which I mean we put the code on the internet and we ran the model in a bunch of configurations to standardized runs, and we're currently in the process of submitting the simulations with the Earth system model to the CMIP archive to be, you know, analysed in these inter-comparison projects for the IPCC report, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of bread and butter of what we do with the model. This is a screenshot from the CLM webpage, which I put up here, just to kind of stress that it's freely available and documented, and so if you go to this page, which is, I don't know if you can see that. Do the slides get kind of posted somewhere? The talk is recorded, so it will be shown. Right, okay. If anyone wants to know, then you can also message me. But yeah, so if you go to you can also Google CLM5 model, and like that will happen. That's fine. So on this page we have documentation, we have instructions for getting the code, we have a user's guide, we have sort of simplistic quick cases that you can start. We're also just very recently developed a version where you can download the code straight onto your laptop. It was always the case before that you had to have a big sort of cluster or a supercomputer on which you would that would be your platform for running the model. And so the last couple of weeks we've made sort of this kind of leap to being able to just port a single point version at least directly onto your computer. So that's cool. So CLM5 is massively modified from its predecessors. This is our list of things that we changed in between CLM 4.5 and 4 and 5, right? So these are the things that we worked on in the last 4 years. And so I'm not going to really go through all of these. We did a bunch of hydrology things, snow things, river things. The thing that I was most involved with personally was this new nitrogen cycle model, which contains a whole bunch of new, I guess, theories of how nitrogen cycling works. We had a nitrogen cycle model before, which, like I said, was roundly criticised in the literature, and everyone said, model's dreadful, you need to update it. And so this is our response to that criticism. And we did some fire updates. We introduced this crop model, which has 6 or 8 crop types globally, and those crop areas change through the sort of future scenarios. We introduced, We introduced a plant hydraulic scheme, a quite simple plant hydraulic scheme, and that paper was published by Daniel Kennedy a couple of weeks ago, based on the Sperrian love theory. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in CLM5, and so that's kind of we kind of consider this to be sort of like the end of that development cycle for that type of model, in the sense that we want to move next onto something else which will allow us to represent a lot of the processes much more with a much higher fidelity. And the thing on the top is called fate. And so in parallel, I've been developing this other model, which has been funded since 2013 by a project external to NCAR, which by the Department of Energy funding in the States. The reason I'm mentioning that is because the project is tropical in its kind of emphasis, and so it's called NG Tropics, the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment in the Tropics. Anyway, the point is that they gave us 5 years of funding. We're writing our next 5 years of funding, and this project funds at least 2 software engineers full-time to work on the model code. And so that's extremely useful. If any of you have done much model development, it's extremely useful to have people whose long-term career is dedicated to maintaining this code and fixing people's problems and fully understanding how it works. And so we built this model called Fates. So Fates is a module which is designed to run inside of land surface models. So it's partly we took the code out, and in principle you can plug it into your own favorite land surface scheme if you're like motivated, and it simulates the parts of the land surface that Fates is involved in are to do with the plants primarily. So it simulates plant physiology, it simulates competition processes for light and water between plants of different plant functional types and different sizes. And from that competition process, it predicts ecosystem assembly. And so from that, it predicts the distribution of different types of vegetation in space. So it's what you might, if you're familiar with the terminology of dynamic vegetation models, it's like a dynamic vegetation model, except that it has plant demography inside it as well. So we have representations of recruitment and of population density and of mortality, which I'll go into more. So previously to this sort of exercise, the kind of default land surface model that runs inside of an IPCC type scenario, CMIP scenario, is a big leaf model, right? And so big leaf models, what they do is they pretend that the land surface looks like this. And so if you go outside in a big leaf model, all the needle leaf trees are like over there, and all the grass is over there, and all the shrubs are in the middle, and they're not competing with each other for light or resources. And so, the broadleaf tree can grow faster and kind of expand its area, but it's a very phenomenological way of representing things. And so the forestry community have typically used the kind of opposite approach, which is an individual-based model, right? Where you model individual trees with a specific location in space, and they compete for light, and they have a stochastic element in that the locations are random, and whether the trees die is semi-random too. And so that's great because that allows you to simulate these kind of ecological processes of recruitment and growth and competition and coexistence and exclusion and mortality and disturbance. But it's expensive, right? Some people run these models globally, but they typically tend to do it with some sort of compromise. So they have a very small sampling of the stochastic space, or they have a very small area, or they run like daily time steps. So there's something you have to do to make it computationally tractable at the moment. That might change, of course. So CREAF is a cohort model in the middle here, which is kind of like a compromise between those two approaches. So the cohort model it's based on is kind of called the ecosystem demography approach, right? So this is in my field. This is like a very famous idea, right? So it was presented by Paul Moorcroft and George Hurd and Steve Pacala from Princeton in 2001, and it's sort of famous, but it's also like really simple in that the system divides the plant community into cohorts, which are grouped according to their plant type, which of course we do anyway, and their height and their successional stage. I'll keep going. So what it does is it takes this tiling we had before of tiling by plant functional type, right? So instead of dividing up our grid cell, our sort of pixel in the climate model like this, when we move to the fates idea, the ed idea, we divide it up like this. And so we divide the land surface up along the successional axis, right? So if you imagine a landscape which is a sort of mosaic of different forests all undergoing succession at sort of different stages, what we do is we sort of take all the bits of the grid cell which are in the first year of succession, and we simulate those as one entity, and so on. So we simulate a sort of young patch, a medium age patch, and an old patch. And within each of those patches, we simulate cohorts of different trees, right? So we simulate trees which can be different sizes and different plant functional types, right? So you can have at the beginning we plant trees of different cohorts, the minimum size. And as succession goes on, those trees grow, and we have recruitment continues at the bottom, and eventually you come to this kind of mature system where you can have different plant functional types and different sizes of different plant functional types, right? So it's like a three-dimensional abstraction of the world. And so if you're used to like how normal land surface models work, or indeed how normal gap models work, this concept takes a while to like get sort of percolate into your head. Anyway, but the benefits of representing this scheme were, I guess they were sort of originally considered as mostly from a kind of a sort of forest demographic perspective, in that by simulating, going from this situation where you have only one average individual, right, which is the big leaf model, you have one average individual of each plant type, to a system where you have a more finely resolved ecosystem with a sort of two more orders of heterogeneity of light availability. The idea is then that the heterogeneity in light availability allows you to compete for light, and that allows plants that maybe grow faster to exclude their competitors, and so we can simulate this idea of simulating coexistence along successional gradients is represented here, and from that we can do this mechanistic assembly of the ecosystem. Like I said, we can predict PFT distributions with this idea called trait filtering, which is kind of this idea that if you prescribe the traits to the different plant functional types, the model will tell you which traits will be successful in which parts of the world, from the environmental space. And then the other motivation is we can simulate recovery from disturbance. And so that's kind of the original motivation. And I give that slide, I presented something like this slide about 400 times in my life. And then gradually as time went on, I came to realize that there's actually loads of things where having a big leaf representation of the world holds you back. And I guess you guys probably don't like need any convincing of that. But some particular examples are, if you're trying to implement a plant hydrodynamic scheme, for example, in a big leaf model, you sort of need to know representation of path length. You need to know how tall the trees are. You need to know what their rooting depth is, the different sizes of tree, and you need representations of how much illumination leaves are getting to predict leaf water potential. None of those things are in a big leaf model. A nutrient model, I think a barrier we came across in the big leaf nutrient model was, nitrogen fixation only really makes sense often in early succession when, photosynthesis is rapid and carbon is abundant and nitrogen is low, and so you need to kind of have that in that model. Fire models are very difficult in big leaf systems because fire obviously operates with these interactions with the canopy structure. If you have an understory fire, you might burn out the small trees, and then the next time a fire wants to come in, the canopy is less flammable because you burnt out all the understory. There's lots of interactions of fire has with canopy structure which were poorly represented inside big leaf models. Snow, for example, snow models need to know whether your vegetation is under the snow or very tall. Pests, bark beetle models, they want to know about tree age, they want to know about tree size. Tree harvest schemes want you to know whether your trees are big or small. Canopy turbulence schemes, which we're increasingly thinking about using, need to know where the leaves are in a canopy. Volatile organic compound models want to know sort of leaf age and leaf cohorts. So there's lots of benefits theoretically of having these more highly resolved models. And so we started developing fates. I should say, I forgot to put this slide in, I should say that we took this idea of ecosystem demography, and for a long time I just called it that. I called it CLM Ed, right? I did that most of the time it existed. And then after a while, we realized that someone had made like an Ed 2, and someone had made like an Ed 1, and someone else had made an Ed X, and someone else. So there was like loads of models called Ed, and eventually we just thought, well, this is too confusing. We'll call our model Fates. We'll call it Functionally Assembled Terrestrial Ecosystem Simulator. And that was just confusing as well, because then everyone was like, is it the same model you had before, or did you just make a new one? Anyway, so you can't win. So it's called Fates. And it's about a year since we changed the name. And so we started motivated by these ideas of regrowth and light competition and trait filtering. And then from that we realized there was a lot of extra sort of interesting features of the model that came with this first implementation. So a thing, for example, that exists in Fates it wasn't very easy to implement in the big leaf model is that we can have arbitrary trait-based plant functional type definitions, right? So most land surface models you'll be familiar with have very fixed ideas about what plant functional types are, right? The PFTs in this model are 14 PFTs like this. And so one of our primary motivations in Fates is to allow the users to define, to some extent, what plant functional types they want to use. We have an I say to some extent, we have an aspiration to, have a default global trait definition that you can use if you want. But the idea is to allow people to say, well, my problem is, a Mediterranean ecosystem which goes from like the sea up to the mountains and differs in hydraulic properties. You can have that kind of system. It can be defined very easily. We have so we have this size structured canopy, and I think with these things in bold, where there are new opportunities to compare to data. So a size structured canopy allows you to compare to a permanent sample plot data, right? So, and then we have leaf area density profiles, which you can compare with LiDAR. We have a flexible allocation scheme in that the model is defined so you can take out the allocation scheme and test it with your own favorite theory, then plug it back in again with different allocation hypotheses. And flexible allometry module, so you can say this module is for tropical rainforest trees, and my trees are like Mediterranean shrubs, so I'm going to change that as well. Lots of these things are hardwired in the earlier versions of models. We're trying to pull all those things out and make them kind of user friendly. And then the next thing so that's the kind of basic canopy structure element of fates that we developed. The next thing we developed is this hydrodynamic scheme, which I'll talk about a bit more later. And so the hydrodynamic scheme allows you to sort of engage a little more with the sort of plant physiological community, in the sense that we can do things like simulate leaf water potential, we can simulate sap flow, which was a data type we couldn't use before, we can simulate variable water root uptake profiles, we can simulate leaf isotopes, we can simulate cavitation and choose tree mortality. When I say we can simulate, if anyone's thinking, well, can they simulate it correctly? What I mean is we have the capacity to simulate it, not like we've nailed how it works everywhere. But like, it's possible. And then we have this fire model, which is based on the Spitfire scheme, which is a kind of commonly used DGVM fire model. And so what that allows you to do is simulate things like sort of the feedbacks between canopy structure and fire spread, and so from that you can simulate sort of what happens to succession when it starts from a burned situation rather than a situation with a single tree mortality or a wind throw, etc. And so we also have a scheme which simulates fire mortality modulated by size, structure, and bark traits. And so you can simulate things like how bark thickness is selected by different fire regimes, and the cost of that process ecologically. Then we have a logging module, so we can take individual types of trees out of the forest and do road damage associated with that. And the last thing is my favourite thing. The whole idea of fates is that we go to this open source development model. And so the idea is that we sort of, I'll back up. The CLM structure we had before was a community-led model, in the sense that people would take our code and they would go away and they would write some modification, and they would email us and they say, hey, I did a modification, and they would come to visit. They would physically come to Boulder and they would present their stuff, and we'd be like, well, that's cool, and we would tell somebody to integrate it into the main bulk of the model, right? So it's, in principle, that's like an open theory. Our motivation is to be much, much more transparent about that process. And so the code that we have lives out in the wild. It lives on a GitHub repository, which anyone can access. If you just get really bored, I'll show you the site. Just go and look at our GitHub repository. And the idea is that the funding we have at NCAR and the DOE, is supportive of a team of software engineers whose job is to kind of test the code, maintain the kind of the trunk of the code, working capacity on lots of different machines and lots of different configurations, which frees up scientists to just come along and say, that thing that you do, that's wrong. Everyone in my field knows that's wrong. How can you possibly have kept this stupid code in for so long? And so the idea is that we can much more transparently accept people's contributions. And I'll talk about that some more later. The other aspirations we have are to have this flexible multiple hypothesis code structure, right? So if someone comes along and says, I want to introduce this theory, we don't say to them, oh no, but our theory is correct, so you can go away. Our very much our aim is to say, we'll introduce your theory into the model with a switch, so that we can test different hypotheses in the same code base, with only those things being different. So having said that, I'll talk about some more details now. Anyone know what it means? Ooh, kick me off. What? How do you start it again?
The icon at the bottom of the screen.
Icon on the bottom.
Yeah.
And then say
accept. Right. Okay. Cool. So yes, Maurizio told me that you guys all come from quite diverse backgrounds, and that some of you are relevant to some fields and some others. So apologies if some parts of these details are meaningless or etc. One of the things we've implemented in Fates is a system for dealing with canopy structure, which is called the perfect plasticity approximation. And that is this idea that in a gap model you have a problem when tree crowns overlap, right? And so gap modelers spent a long time creating gap models where, where the leaves would fall off when the trees overlapped, or the trees would like bend a little bit to get in a gap with the canopy. And eventually they kind of came to this conclusion that what they were trying to simulate is this kind of system where trees essentially fill in all the available space in the canopy. And that's really useful in a kind of one-dimensional modeling perspective, because it means you can sort of ignore all the complexities of the crown filling and just say, well, when the crown is full, everything else has to go into the understory. So our model splits the system into a canopy layer and an understory layer, right? So everything in the canopy gets the same amount of light, and everything in the understory gets the same amount of light on its top leaf surface. And what that means is that you can sort of help that this system assists like coexistence happening between plants which have very small differences in fitness that don't necessarily translate into one being in the canopy and one being shaded. So that's one thing. Whether you use this system or not differs between different vegetation models. So this is a figure from a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago with lots of people who were all this. I should have said before, this idea of introducing demography into system models is not a thing which we're doing in isolation. Many Earth system modeling centres are kind of pushing in the same direction. So we wrote a paper in Global Change Biology which was trying to kind of compare and contrast all the different ideas that are out there. And so, one of the things that we found at the workshop we had was that everyone was thinking about how trees acquire light in quite different ways. And so, the original ED model has canopies like this, one of which completely shade the top one, completely shades the second one, and so on and so on. This other model, the LM3 model from GFDL, has a similar model to ours, except it has a much more extreme differentiation between the canopy and the understory. Other models, like I said, individual-based models have a more sort of three-dimensional view of the world. But there's lots of debate on how you conduct this process of deciding how a tree's size affects its resource acquisition. So that's something we're working on quite a lot. I think we just introduced, and so that's why I've got a slide on it, is leaf aging, leaf physiological aging. So now we have n cohorts of leaves that change their VC max as time goes on, right? So you can say the young leaves have higher VC max than the old ones, and so what that means is that in seasonal ecosystems you can predict peaks in leaf physiology when the leaves are coming on as productivity bumps up. So that's helped us get some of the dynamics of tropical forests much better than we did before. Like I said, we have a choice of allometry models. These are three figures, which are the allometry scheme is diameter mass and diameter above ground biomass and diameter height. And so you define three allometric curves of your choice, then you can have any allometry scheme you like. Our plant mortality model, at the moment, it has 4 types of mortality. So it has background mortality, which I'll talk about. It has carbon starvation mortality, whereby the tree death ramps up if the carbon in the store drops below a kind of target level. The target level is something you can, in principle, go out and measure in the field, but we're slowly accumulating data on this topic of how much carbon trees maintain for the off season, that kind of thing. But our idea is that our basic idea is that the more we build in mechanisms into models, the easier it is for physiologists to justify going out and measuring things, and so it's a little bit of a circular process. We have hydraulic failure mortality. If H hydro is on, the trees will die if their cavitation goes above a particular threshold. And we have a cold stress mortality as well. An interesting point so we're thinking quite a lot about introducing wind throw mortality into the model. But an interesting point about this is if you keep introducing new kinds of mortality, wind throw, bugs, pathogens, what your background mortality is should in principle keep going down, right? Because it's like the unexplained part of mortality. And so we're having lots of discussions with permanent sample plot people about what we consider to be the background mortality. So that's interesting. And then Spitfire, I'm going to talk about a little bit. So Spitfire sort of has this, it's kind of quite a linear approach to generating fires and vegetation damage. The model, the FATES model itself tracks 6 different kinds of fuel, right? So it tracks trunks, large branches, small branches, twigs, leaves, live grass. And it tracks the fire weather. So there are many fire weather indices. We have maybe 3 fire weather indices right now, which predict the flammability of the fuels. And so Spitfire determines the fuel state and the load, how much fuel is combusted, fire frequency and behaviour, and the area burned. Things it predicts in the interim, it predicts the crown scorch height from the fuel burned and the fire intensity, right? So if we're predicting crown scorch height, the idea is that we can predict, the level to which the trees are burned in the system, so we can have the size, structured impact of fire. I should say that Spitfire is primarily based on mostly work from the 80s by the Canadian Forest Service, right? And so it's present in many global models, but it's generally quite poorly parameterized and tested in most places. So we're focused on making it better for the tropics, but there's lots more work to do on that. So in principle, a fire can come through and kill the small trees, leaving the big tree standing, or we can have canopy fires, etc. And then we have FATES Hydro, which is mostly the work of Brad Christopherson, who's a professor at the University of Texas now, and Chongyang Zhu, who's at Salamos, and Nate McDowell, and Ryan Knox, our software engineer. So FATES Hydro is a pretty straight representation of the Sperry model, if most of you are familiar with that. And so we're predicting fluxes and water fluxes and water potentials at actually a sort of, you can define how many nodes you want the system to have yourself. The standard thing we use is leaf, stem, transport route, and absorbing route. And then in the soil, Brad has this nice system where he discretizes the soil into these things he calls rhizosphere shells. And so the further you are away from the root, the wetter the soil will be. And so the system can dry out these layers of soil right next to the root surface and create these bottlenecks if the system allows to water transport. And of course, this system allows you to ingest a much greater range of plant hydraulic traits into the model than you previously would be able to. So it's driven with conductivity, Kmax numbers, and P50 numbers, pressure volume curves for all these different tissues, right, for each plant functional type. So it's quite parametrically heavy. But the idea is that we can, interact much more intensively with the plant physiological community as a result. And so a thing you might think with this is, you might think, well, if I'm doing plant hydraulics and I'm also doing demography, I'm just going to get really confused about what's driving what. And that's a valid concern. I think we've done in the recent past is to think pretty hard about how to manage the complexity of such a big model, right? And so what we're trying to do is develop modes of running the model which allow you to turn off the dynamics in the part you're not interested in, right? And so the first mode we've established is something called static stand structure, which is you give the model a known forest structure, right? Plant functional types by size class structure. And say you want to test all of this stuff, right? You can just run this known forest, and you can say, I want to know whether my FATES Hydro is working correctly with stomatal conductance routine A or stomatal conductance routine B. Right? So you can turn off all of the recruitment and sand structure and mortality and growth and allometry and everything. And the next mode we actually have is called prescribed physiology mode, and that's the opposite, right? So that's saying, I'm the kind of person that's interested in how stand structure develops in forests. And so you basically overwrite the NPP in the model. You give the model growth rates and mortality rates for the different levels in the canopy. And so from that you can test whether all this is working as it should. The next mode we're going to introduce is like a static vegetation system. So instead of allowing the model to just freely predict where vegetation grows, you can have it start from a vegetation map and say, it's all very well, but the model does some crazy thing with needle-leaf trees and produces them in like Panama or something, which totally does all the time. And so we're going to overwrite that too. And so we're developing all these quite a few ways of allowing people with particular interest to turn off different parts of the model. Oh, that's not the end. Weird. Maybe I'll try that other one. Right. So, like I said, I didn't have enough time to. Gosh, is that the time? It's only 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
We're supposed to go until 4, right? So I could. Pardon?
How long have you got?
Well, that's how long do I have? No, I don't have an infinite amount, but I can skip this bit if we're running short time.
Let's write this book at 9.
Pardon? No, but some of this is like a bit dull, right? I'm going to show you one application, right? So this is just a kind of a proof of concept. So this is Fates running pan-tropically with the fire turned on. And this particular study, we have lots and lots of ongoing studies, as I'll show you in a minute. So Fates, in the top panel, the fire is turned on at 10 years, right? So probably at the beginning of the simulation when the trees are small. And here, the fire is turned on at 50 years, when the trees are quite big. And so you can see between the different implementations, the degree to which fire is excluded by the stand structure changes quite a lot. This is work from my colleague Jackie Schumann at NCAR. And also, we're getting reasonable LAI estimates and reasonable NPP metrics globally. And this one I like, so I'll talk about this. So one of the things I'm thinking about doing is kind of revisiting how plant functional traits are defined in Earth system models. And so what we want to do in the first instance is like drastically simplify what happens. So what I've been doing is a series of experiments where I just have one trait that differs between the plant functional types, right? And so this is what happens when you have one plant functional trait with low allocation to storage, one with high allocation to storage. And as you might expect, what happens is that in this figure, the low storage allocation one grows faster and outcompetes the other one. And so it's dominant in closed canopy systems, right? And vice versa, the one which stores things for the off-season is dominant in poorer conditions. When we change leaf CN and VC max, so we have one plant functional type with high photosynthesis and high respiration, another one with low photosynthesis and low respiration. This is what we find. This is a little more complicated. What we find is that in the cold places, your high respiration rates don't matter very much because it's cold, and so you get the high VC max one dominating. But in sort of hotter and drier places, you can't use that extra photosynthetic capacity, so the respiration is more of a cost, right? And so I did that kind of study for a whole bunch of different single trait comparisons, and this is plotting out the answers in climate space, so temperature versus precip. And so what you find is that where blue happens, one PFT dominates, and where yellow happens, the other one dominates. And so this is what we find was the storage one. So the storage one here is sort of pretty archetypal because the low storage condition is winning in sort of high productivity environments and vice versa. The C3 versus C4 grass is like this. Obviously, as you might expect, the C3 is not competing in hot conditions, and so on and so on. But what this kind of climate envelope tells you is, which traits are actually defining where the biome boundaries are in the model, right? And so what we found here is that we had trait filtering mostly happening along this productivity or not productivity axis, but not much happening on a kind of temperature climate gradient, or indeed on a precipitation gradient. And so we're kind of thinking about more temperature focused traits that we can introduce into the model to kind of produce those kind of patterns. And so, yeah, so like I said, Fates lives inside of a host land surface model, right? So you can't run Fates by itself. You have to run it attached to the CLM, or in this, at the moment you have all the ELM, which is the Department of Energy's Earth system model. So at the moment it has 2 hosts. It could have more, and so its module looks like this, right? So everything inside the Fates box is a process owned by Fates, and everything here is a process that your host land model has to provide. So if, these are kind of standard sort of like hydrology and energy features of land surface models, etc. And so that's how we divide up our 2 different code bases. There's the left-hand side one lives inside the CLM code base for now, and the stuff in the box lives in the Fates code base. And so I'll skip that. And so Fates lives, like I said, it lives at this repository, github.com ngt/Fates. And the reasons for this are, the reason that we made it completely public, we sort of thought about this, right? Because it's like, people will ask us to do lots of things to the model, they'll ask lots of questions, they'll ask for support. So it's not like a trivial thing to just suggest that we're going to support this whole effort online. But we figured that the more eyes on our code, make code better, it'll allow better coordination of developments and fewer overlaps. And the idea is that we have this forum for open collaboration. You can direct a question to the whole community of users there. You can say, hey guys, anyone ever think about this? And invariably somebody will have thought about it before and will come back to you with like, well, I tried that in that model, it didn't work, but we could try it here again, etc. This kind of effort requires like solid funding, the maintenance of the support system, which is the thing that, for now at least, is pretty much sorted out. And then people kind of maintain some sort of community ethical guidelines. And right now we have no problems with people's ethics, but we have guidelines nonetheless. We have tutorials accessible from the wiki on our GitHub, right? So you can go on there and take the practical on how to run Fates, which is like, should get you up and running. You can run this. The instructions are here for running CLM on your laptop. That's a new thing. We have technical documentation, so this huge scientific document about where all the pieces of the model come from, which you maintain as well. And so we have a whole bunch of planned activities. I guess I won't go through this in great depth. A lot of studies in California, lots of studies in land use. We're currently beginning a process of implementing nutrient modeling with like multiple hypotheses for that. We have a project with the University of Oslo thinking about plant traits at high altitudes. We have a project with Los Alamos looking at insect tree mortality and a high resolution fire model, and it's this ever expanding list of things going on. But we need quite a lot more stuff, obviously, like the process of representing like all of the things living on the surface of the Earth. It's like kind of an ambitious idea. So our vision is for Fates to be this tool for testing alternative eco-physiological and ecological hypotheses, right? So we really want people to come and say, I've got a better idea, help me implement it. So we've designed the code specifically to accept new ideas. Calibration and spin-up is kind of a challenging thing, so we're thinking about mathematical techniques for dealing with that. And new model testbeds. So we're trying very hard to integrate this system called the International Land Model Benchmarking Project, which is this website. Trying really hard to kind of generate a place where all of our individual ways of testing the model live all together. And so that's the thing people can contribute to. And so, yeah, so this is my most important slide. So my question is, do you work on an eco-physiological processes that you think is poorly represented in climate models? Most papers in my field begin with a line or something along the lines of, this is a thing, and it's represented very poorly in climate models. And so what we're trying to do is help overcome that endless state of affairs. And so we have lots of ways to get involved. We have bi-weekly Fates teleconferences, which are the socially friendly hour of 8 p.m. Central European time. And But also you can write an issue on GitHub to a sort of, if you have an idea, you can say, hey, I've got this idea. Email me if you want to ask any specific questions. You can sign up for alerts when we have new model releases or meetings. And we have Fates developers in a variety of attractive locations globally. So we host visitors at Toulouse and at NCAR and LBNL and Los Alamos, Oslo and Brookhaven and Oak Ridge. So yeah, there's a lot of coming and going. So yeah, if anyone wants to get involved, then ask me some questions. I'm very keen in particular to see people sort of interrogate this kind of next generation system model. You know, ideally before it hits the sort of CMIP process in the next round, 4 or 5 years time. It would be better if people had got involved earlier in thinking about how to make it better. Anyway, I'm sorry for going almost to the end, but anyway, thank you.
Excellent. I really enjoyed this concept of the democratization of the demystification of.
Fun?
I really enjoy the concept of democratizing and demystifying this global land models.
It's not actually very mysterious. That's the thing.
No. Okay. But I guess I don't know if there are any questions. Anybody wants to start asking questions? Okay.
I should say I'm quite deaf and I've forgotten my hearing aids, so talk really loudly.
Well, thanks for this clear presentation and review. At the beginning, you said that this last version was improved for nitrogen, but there were many things to explain to us. I understand, but during the presentation, you just addressed nitrogen issue in one of the points of the diagram. This flexible allometric stoichiometry, but there was nothing else in nutrients.
Yeah, so
can you explain a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I talked about the CLM standard model and the Fates model. So they're in different places with regards to nutrients. So the CLM5 model has a nitrogen cycle which built on the CLM4 code, but we changed a great deal. And that's actually like a whole another hour of talking. But Fates currently doesn't have nitrogen active. That's like going to change in maybe 6 months' time. The Fates model, we're building a CNP model, so it's going to have phosphorus because it's tropical forest focused. The nitrogen cycle in CLM5 it's mostly based on this idea called FUN, which is the idea that there's like a marketplace for nitrogen in the ecosystem. You can fix nitrogen, you can retranslocate it, or you can acquire it from active processes. And so the plants decide like where they're going to spend it calculates like a cost of nitrogen in the environment, and the plants decide where they're going to spend their carbon. Right, so the sources of nitrogen switch in CLM5 from fixation to active uptake, etc. And so it also has like a flexible allometry scheme, which is very, very rudimentary. Yeah. So the interesting thing about that is that the previous model had a system whereby when there wasn't enough nitrogen, it would just burn off the carbon, right? So it would say, well, we wanted to do this much photosynthesis, but we've only got this much nitrogen, and so we'll just pretend that the photosynthesis never happened and get rid of it, right? And that was really strange. And so our new system takes the carbon and spends it on something, you know. And yeah, so we actually have the system model to CLM that I mentioned, that has 2 different nitrogen models in it as well. So we're trying to build our new Fates code to be very flexible to adopt to all these different theories. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. But I see that I was mixing the structure and CLM and Fates.
Right.
Thing that
it's
a difference that we still don't get.
But yeah, like my other talk is about the CLM5 nitrogen cycle, because like it was my job to put all the bits together. So yeah. Anyway.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
Thanks very much for this exciting talk. I have one very general question and one very specific. So the general one is just, I'm curious to know what's the level of coordination between different land models. I mean, is it how does it work in practice? I mean, there are several of those models developed in different places, which I suppose is good. Keeping this diversity is probably good, but is there some level of coordination in terms of...
Is there no, broadly not, no. Cross-fertilization of land models tends to happen when somebody moves from someone else's lab to someone else's lab, yeah. Like, that thing that was in there, it's now also in there. So, but there's no overall coordination. Broadly because it's quite hard to coordinate a single group, let alone internationally. And the way the system modelling works, it's very like nationalised. We were talking at lunch about nationalism. It's like each country has to have its own model, at least one, if not two or four in America's case. So that tends to mean that people apply for funding to their own national agency, right? And the national agency won't fund development on anything other than the model that's there, and so everyone becomes a little bit kind of compartmentalized in what they're doing, which is cool because that, in some ways, because it means that people can go off and explore different parts of the space completely to each other. But the whole thing is very difficult because all the models are different from each other in so many different ways, and so when we do an intercomparison project, we end up with 10 different lines, no one has any idea why. And so the hypothesis testing that I kept alluding to in FATES, we want to be able to sort of explore the space the model produces with like different model structures and parameters in a way which is more robust. Say we understand why a model might produce a very high climate sensitivity or a low climate sensitivity, that kind of thing. What was your specific question?
Yeah, it's so on the hydraulic model phase, these several, you call them soil
shells.
Shells, yes. So why are they important? Do you really need several shells to reproduce some of the dynamics you see in soil water balance, soil to plant water transport? What's the theory behind needing several of these shells?
I fundamentally it's the same theory as why you discretize the plant continuum, right? Because it's like, well, the conductivity of the soil is a function of its water potential, and so the water potential at close to the root is going to be different to the water potential of the bulk soil, and therefore if you just use some average number, you're not capturing the bottleneck, which is
my question is, so if you normally use the model with 3 layers for the plant, why do you need more in the soil? So is there any... That
might be a bit of poetic license. I mean, it's just n, right? So it's modifiable. So the parameter file just takes n. You define the site, the number of soil rhizosphere shells you want, and you define them.
My question was whether you had found a situation in which the model only worked or only reproduced properly the dynamics if you had, I don't know, more than 5, 6, 10, whatever, of those shells.
No, we haven't found that thing. I mean, I think you know this more than I do, but there's some indication in the literature that the bottleneck might be in the sort of in the rhizosphere to water transport. But I guess I don't know. I don't know that the figure is some poetic license of the number of soil layers, because I know that Brad has been like experimenting with different numbers of the layers, but, shells. The interesting thing is how you like map the shells aren't real. They're just sort of notional. How you map them onto the vertical soil layer structure. When water comes from the layer above, which shell does it fill in? Does it fill the shells that are driest, or just fill them all equally? And that's kind of difficult. I think it's a useful concept to have in there. Particularly, it doesn't make the model much more complicated because it's already solving the sort of Richard's equation along the whole continuum. It's just really taking something which already exists in the sort of soil physics world and expanding the whole system up to the leaf. So it doesn't, change very much. Questions?
Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming then, and thanks again to Rosie for the